Yes, Stephen, we see your screen. Thank you.
Perfect. That's great. Okay, right. Let me just swap over. Okay, I'm just going to go off camera just to save on the bandwidth. I trialed this with Nelson earlier yesterday, and it didn't work very well. So let's see how we go today. All right. So my talk is called The Economies of Faith. Nelson asked me to speak on this topic, and it's a topic that is very close to my heart. As someone who researches entrepreneurship, it's often rare that faith comes such overtly into my way of working. And so when Nelson asked me to speak on the global context of faith-driven enterprise, I jumped at the opportunity. Both as a researcher, this is an area that fascinates me as the potential for delivering transformation through God's kingdom, but also the legacy that we inherit. I think Nelson touched on some incredible points that I hope my talk complements. So the purpose of this next 45 minutes or so, the talk is broken into two parts. Firstly, I'm going to sort of talk about how we have come to where we are as faith-driven entrepreneurs and understand what has driven faith-driven entrepreneurs over the last few hundred years. Like we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we need to understand our story as Christians and our heritage as Christian businessmen and investors to understand where we belong and the vision that God has given us for his kingdom and the future. So my story is to try and tell a little bit about the journey that we've all come on to date, and then take a moment to talk about the global landscape of entrepreneurship that we see it when we find ourselves in as Christians, and to tell the story of what faith-driven entrepreneurship looks like today. We will round off the conversation with a overview of the global landscape of what faith-driven entrepreneurship looks like, and set up the opportunity for us to engage with what the challenges are as faith-driven entrepreneurs for us today to help see more of God's transformational power across the world. So I'm just going to, apologies if I'm a bit clunky, I'm swapping in between slides and the talk. So to start off, the idea of this conversation that Nelson and I had around faith-driven entrepreneurship has given me an opportunity to speak about a topic that I'm very passionate about, and that's covenant. Covenant is, for me, one of the most important and overlooked topics of faith-driven enterprise. It's where we inherit so much of our economics from. It is where we inherit so much of our world from, and it's where we inherit so much of who we as Christian entrepreneurs are today. And so, rooted in this idea of our global capitalist world that we live in, our economic systems that we live in, there was also a version of early capitalism that looked very different to what we have today. And that early vision of the economic system that we have today actually looked covenantal, as opposed to sort of the self-interested transactional world that we often find ourselves operating in. And I want to take some time to tell that story today. So I'm going to start off by telling what is covenant, covering both what is covenant in scripture and in society. So covenant, as I've defined here, is a sacred binding promise rooted in God's faithfulness, calling individuals and communities to mutual respect, accountability, and a shared purpose under divine authority. Covenant represents a deep binding promise between God, a person, or people groups. It is the hidden binding force in human society, and it transcends mere institutional or legal frameworks, and it is the moral and spiritual foundation of human relationality and the relationship that we have with God. Covenant defines the terms of how we engage with others, and it mediates the spaces between individuals and groups. And covenant is not merely a social thing, it is what underpins all of humanity's interactions. We as spiritual beings are rooted in covenant with God, and the outworking of covenant is the kingdom values that God has called into being for us to live as he intended. From a sociological point of view, we see three different ways that humans have defined relationships. These aren't spiritual, these are just from the social context, but they reflect a really interesting story about how we reflect in our world today. The three types of social agreements that we have in human society are contract, compact, and covenant. Contract is what dominates our world today. Contract is often understood as an employment contract, or as something that you purchase, or a good or service that you deliver based on an agreement. Two individuals exchanging a good in exchange for money. Compact is something that's a bit more public and a bit more collaborative. Compact is often set up as a strategic document of how people intend to collaborate on a project. It is setting out sort of norms and values that people want to try and aspire to follow. And then there's covenant. Covenant is this deeper moral and spiritual relationship that we hold with God and between God and his people. It is the mediating force that helps us understand who we as Christians are, and it keeps us distinct and separate from the world. Covenant, through covenanting with God, the outworking of that covenant is his kingdom values in business, in family, in marriage, in friendship, in government. It defines the very basis of nations, and it defines the very basis of political orders, if it's given the opportunity to define that. But today, in our world where we see such division and exploitation, covenant very rarely gets such a global stage. But that wasn't always the story, and the story of early capitalism was built and founded on Christian covenant, and it deeply excites me of the impact that it has for society today. When we think about covenant in Scripture, we see it in a range of different traditions. We see it both in the Jewish and Old Testament tradition, and we also see it in the New Testament. In the Jewish tradition, covenant is the foundational relationship between God and humanity, particularly embodied in God's promise to figures such as Abraham, Moses, and the people of Israel. It signifies both divine initiative and human response, and it is the partnership that binds the Creator and creation in mutual obligation and sacred purpose. For the Jews, this covenantal relationship defines the identity of Israel as a chosen people that are tasked with living as a light to the nations. As we know, this is promised to Abraham in Genesis 12. In the Hebrew, we find different words that describe this type of covenantal relationship. And three of the most prominent words that are most beautifully articulated in the Hebrew to describe covenant are these three words on the slides. I sat with my vicar yesterday trying to pronounce this, and I did a terrible job, so I'm just going to say the English, my version of it, but I think we've all been there, right? But so we have this word called berith, which is the sacred agreement. In the Hebrew, it comes from this idea of cutting and binding, or cutting and bonding together. It comes from this idea of rooted in actions of cutting and binding, and berith signifies both the separateness of parties and their profound unity in a shared sacred agreement. It also signifies the separateness of a newly covenanted party from absolutely everything else. Hesed is this beautiful word that essentially there's no equal to it in the English translation. It's the closest that my vicar said was that it's ever loving and everlasting kindness. Hesed is God's unfailing love that renews and expands the covenant that we enter into. Even when humanity falters or when we fall short, it stretches beyond through time and space to reach us. That is the everlasting, ever-stretching love of God, set that is bound and cut to us. And through the outworking of both berith and hesed, we find ourselves in shalom, God's peace and wholeness. Through shalom, harmony is restored as God intended, where justice blooms and creation thrives. God created the world in shalom, and when we live out our covenant with God, as he calls us to, shalom becomes the state that we find ourselves in, and it extends to the world by virtue of it. Through the covenant God made with Israel, he calls them to embody divine purpose, fostering love and life on earth, serving as a light to the nations and a testament to God's redemptive plan for creation. And then in Christianity, we find covenant's fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Jesus embodies God's promise to Israel and extends them to all of humanity in this beautiful divine dance that we see throughout history. Through his life and his teachings and his sacrificial death, we see the ultimate expression of those covenants played out before us. There are two particular types of covenant that are highlighted in the New Testament. We have the new covenant in Christ, where Jesus calls his disciples friends, deepening the relational intimacy of the covenant and inviting them to be a part of the restoration of society as God intended. And then we see the personal and universal. The New Testament presents a covenant that is both personal, transforming individuals' lives, and universal, which is encompassing all of creation. It points to the eschatological reign of God, a future defined by justice, peace, and restoration of all things. This is covenant. This is what we as Christians have inherited. This is our great inheritance. And through living out the covenant with God, we extend this to the world. Christ's covenant offers us hope and reconciliation, calling believers to embody its love and faithfulness. It's in their own lives, and it's a testament to God's eternal promise. When we look at this through the lens of society, we see covenant expressed in a variety of different forms. Socially speaking, covenant shapes the very fabric of human life, and it has done for generations before us. Where covenant has perhaps given way to things like more contract-oriented relationships, covenant still exists, it still thrives. Covenant provides the foundation for our relationships, from the intimate, such as friendship or marriage, to the collective, where covenant is defining nationhoods and political order. We only have to look at America to see where covenant originated from. Covenant, the very word of covenant and covenantal theology, was one of the fundamental underpinnings of the Declaration of Independence. While there are other agreements like contracts that define things like offering people a good or service for a certain fixed price, covenant embodies the spirit of those interactions. We often forget or take for granted the interactions that we have with people through the types of actions that we have as business people. Whether or not we are delivering a contract for a client, we are still interacting with them. And it's that space in between that covenant still exists if we allow it or if we're living within it. For Christians, our interactions in these spaces are defined by the values of God's kingdom that covenant lives out, which are love, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Covenant lifts humans beyond the mundane transactions of power or economics and aligns us with the interactions with God's eternal purpose for creation. And when we think about the roles of covenant in society, we can see that it strengthens the social fabric through shared values. It provides moral accountability for social systems, and it transforms ordinary transactions into purposeful engagements. This sounds very familiar to Nelson's talk about what it means for business's mission, and I think covenant is part of BAM's inheritance and part of BAM's future. When we look at covenant in society, covenantal principles strengthen communities, but when we neglect covenant, it leads to societal breakdown and alienation. In our world today, where the market is God and self-interest dominates and exploitation and profit is king, we lose covenant and covenant becomes the background to the world stage that it was intended to be the front of. And when we think about this in our contemporary economic systems that prioritize self-interest and consumption, it breaks covenantal ties to community, creation, and justice. For the first time, in the last 100 years, inequality globally has never been as extensive as it is today. And arguably, we've had 100 years where covenant has not been at the forefront of global economics and the global economic system that we've inherited. And that is the key for us, I believe, as Christians, is we need to be living fundamentally through covenant and covenantal capitalism in order to remake the economic system that we're seeing. Like, capitalism itself is a product of original covenant capitalism, but it's given way to this transaction to more contract-oriented capitalism. And as part of, and for me, covenantal capitalism is fundamental to us for transforming the system that we want to live in. And when we look at covenant and entrepreneurship, we see a number of different things. I've put here in the slide that what covenantal capitalism is businesses transcending self-interest to create economic systems that reflect God's values of love, justice, and community. As Christians, we're called to revive covenantal consciousness, creating communities and businesses that are rooted in shared accountability of God's values. And Christian entrepreneurs must transcend profit motives. We must use our business skills and our gifts to reflect God's love, justice, and stewardship. And through the act of being in covenant with God as business, we transform society for the common good. And I think this is where we see a fundamental break in how business has been conducted over the last few hundred years. Is business is broken from covenant. Business has become a thing in its own right. It's become something that the market has defined. And the rules of the game, let's say the rules of how we engage in markets, how we look for products to sell, how we look for margins to be squeezed, how we look for efficiency to be saved, how we look for productivity to be enhanced. All of these are things in and of themselves, good and fine, but when they don't act out in the system and the rules that they were originally defined by and where they came from, they create a system that is further and further away from its origins, and that is covenantal capitalism. And very briefly, let me tell you a little story of early capitalism's Christian roots. I think many of you might be familiar with this, but I think it's also a fascinating story. So things like the 13th century Cistercian monks, they were originally they had these plots of land where they produced agriculture, and they grew with such efficiency and they grew with such acclaim that they ended up trading, and their innovation and their sort of nose for profit was not ignored as a spirit or as a byproduct of their vocation. They invented ways of doing agricultural productivity that we still know and celebrate and inherit today. They're often acclaimed as being some of the very first organizations to take profits from their labors to reinvest it back into their own businesses. But they were also fundamentally rooted in moral stewardship of all their goods and all of their resources for the purposes of God's kingdom. If we fast forward to the 17th to the 19th century, we have a very unpleasant experience in Europe at the time. There's a lot going on in Europe that the world is constantly being reformed by and reshaped by, and its international reach has extended pain and suffering through its systems. But within the midst of this period, there was this shift in faith and faith communities that we could collectively call the nonconformists. Now, the nonconformists tended to be people such as Quakers or Methodists or Puritans or Brethren. These nonconformists were called nonconformists because they were deliberately marginalized from mainstream state and from mainstream church. But their collective network of being removed from society, of being persecuted for their religious beliefs that weren't the mainstream of the state or the Church of England, led them to being marginalized in society. And when these communities became more established, for example, the Quakers, they often were people who were yeomen, who were pastoralists that then moved into artisan or cottage industry through textiles and through light manufacturing. But it was these intense networks that they were rooted in, such as being identified as tradespeople or as craftspeople, but also through their covenantal theology that was often defined as a nonconformist. Their covenantal theology led them to develop models of doing business that rooted God's covenantal outworking at the center of it. For a lot of these people, particularly the Quakers, they were seeing business as a sacrament. The act of business had to serve the purpose of God's kingdom. And it was through this relationship and through the the networks of nonconformists that gave birth to the Industrial Revolution. It was through the mining and through the innovation of steel manufacturing, of smelting, that gave rise to the production of this. A lot of the innovations that birthed out of the Industrial Revolution were Quaker and were Methodist and Unitarian. But at the heart of all of these business models, all of these Christian entrepreneurs from the 17th and 19th century were trying to live in a way that was distinct from the world. And that included how they lived as their businesses and how they lived out their businesses. Similarly, the covenantal theology had a transatlantic reach. As people in the 17th and 19th centuries migrated to the United States, but largely out of their persecution, they took their covenantal theology with them, and with it they incubated different expressions of economic innovation and covenantal principles that gave rise to a particular expression of American capitalism. Much of that we reflect on today is inherited from that type of economic system, albeit covenant has been left behind or it's been broken in the process. But what is really distinct from this story is the critical mass of Christian enterprise in this time. The critical mass of Christian enterprise was so expansive and so all-encompassing that it set a moral standard for economic productivity that looked like covenant. So what I mean by that is the value of caring for their community, loving their neighbor, taking care of their workers. All of these entrepreneurs implemented mechanisms and methods to make sure that then their workers were taken care of, that their business practices were ethical. Quakers back in the 17th and 18th century were practicing sustainability. They were very conscious of their supply chains and where those supply chains or where behaviors in those supply chains faltered. For example, there might be a company that was trying to shaft or to maximize more profit than what they were due. That this moral standard of Christian enterprise corrected it as if it was a market failure. This was particularly prominent in the Quakers. Quakers would work with business people that weren't necessarily nonconformists, but in order for those people to partner in business with these Christians, they had to conform to the standards of covenantal enterprise that these businessmen and women were modeling. And so faith-driven entrepreneurs pioneered practices that balance profitability with moral purpose, and they left a massive legacy of business innovation and societal reform. I spent a bit of time reading up on this because it's an area that I find fascinating, but just look at all of this list. Look at the list of different innovations that we have inherited from Christian and early faith-driven entrepreneurs. They gave us the early forms of banking. They gave us the very first fixed prices. Quakers were known particularly for their trust and for being trustful businessmen, that the Quakers were known for never bartering or never haggling. And it was through the trust that people had in the reliability of Quaker entrepreneurs that they stopped bartering or they stopped trying to haggle. And it was the very first experience of where fixed prices were practiced. They gave us press advertising, they gave us branding and quality assurance and hygienic packaging of foods. Right through from operations, where they were the very first innovators to provide vertical integration of their extraction, production, and distribution systems. They were also sustainable. They also practiced sustainable resource management and the production and made sure that their supply chains were, as the standards could allow, were as sustainable and ethical as possible. In finance, it was these nonconformist bankers that gave us commercial papers such as the very first unsecured loans, short-term debt instruments, and they gave us accessible banking systems. With regards to employment relations, Quaker and nonconformist business people pioneered things like cooperative movement. They pioneered adult education on company time, hot meals for their employees. They gave us the minimum wage. They gave us the 9 to 5. All of these innovations that were pioneered by faith-driven entrepreneurs, they were done so not because of the profit line, but because of the covenant that they were living out. They were so conscious that they needed to care for their neighbor, to make sure that their workers were looked after, to make sure that there was as little exploitation in those systems as possible. Granted, Europe in the 17th and 19th centuries was an awful place by contemporary standards, but the moral majority of these entrepreneurs at the time were doing things differently, and they were renowned for it. The governments even traveled to these businesses to look at how they could take some of these examples and turn them into policy. For example, it gave us education policy, it gave us pensions, it gave us huge societal reform. And even today, when we look at sort of how we can change and deal with today's global poly-crisis world that we live in, climate change, inequality, exploitation, the rise and the threat of gig economy work, where the labor rights are being watered down, we can look back in history and we can see that actually, like, some of these Christian entrepreneurs were pioneering early forms of philanthropy. They pioneered the earlier forms of corporate philanthropy that we now see as CSR and as ESG, all of these things. But it was the mindset of Christ within these entrepreneurs that made them conscious about it. And it wasn't just because they were feeling altruistic that they helped their workers or their production lines. It was also good business. The critical mass of Christian entrepreneurs during this time that gave us so much of the innovations of things like industrial capitalism and the policies and instruments that we use today, that it was just good business. Ethical business works. And I think this is where Nelson was talking a little bit about social enterprise, and how social enterprise is sometimes good business, but it's not kingdom business. And sometimes the market tries to tell the world that it can solve all of the problems. For example, setting up a social enterprise to sell a social good is not the same as that business just doing it better and setting a global standard for business to be better. And if I had Nelson on the line, I'm sure he would have he'd have some really exciting thoughts to reflect on that with me. But all of these other innovations that we have from Christians, I'm setting these here to illustrate that we stand on the shoulders of giants. Christians back in the 17th and 19th century were covenanting with their business practices, and the outworking of covenanting in business were all of these social and economic innovations that helped to get workers decent wages, helped people reduce the health and safety crisis in their offices, that helped line up hot meals, that helped line up funeral care or health care that was needed, holiday pay. All of these things were because it was just covenant business that helped define them. Or at least that's the story that I love about reading about our history. And realistically, it sets us up for how do we move forward? Where do we go from here? How do we, as faith-driven entrepreneurs, respond to the challenges and the crises that we find ourselves in today? And with it, how do we bring God's kingdom to earth? And I'm just going to slow down here because that is sort of the setting of the stage for our next part of the talk, which is the global landscape of faith-driven entrepreneurs. We need to understand. So we've understood where we've come from. We understand that there's a legacy that gave us the economic systems, or some parts of our economic systems, through covenant capitalism. But along the way, covenant has been broken, and our economic system is a system that has been broken with covenant. It's an economic system that is defined by self-interest, exploitation, and corruption in many cases. But whilst we know that our economic systems we're not in heaven with God yet, we have this ability through covenant with Christ to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, and to look at the markets and the economics of today and say, this is not covenant, this is not Christ-like, this is not faith-driven entrepreneurship or what it could be. And that's the story that I want to tell next. I want to look at what faith-driven entrepreneurship looks like globally, look at what it means for us to view covenant as a model for faith-driven entrepreneurship today, and try to identify what are the opportunities and the challenges that faith entrepreneurs today are being faced with, and how do we move forward with that. So with that, we're moving on to our second part. And I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to stop for questions, but I will just encourage you all to go and get a drink whilst we're talking. This next section will probably be around the same amount of time, and hopefully we can have a bit of time for questions at the end. So when it comes to thinking about what faith-driven entrepreneurship is, Nelson set a really, really wonderful example, and far more detailed than this, on what BAM is and what a BAM business person looks like. But here I want to just share and build on that to say, what does a covenantal entrepreneur look like? When we compare contemporary entrepreneurship with covenantal entrepreneurs, what are the things that distinctly define us? What were the things that separated these entrepreneurs out from the others? And I think that there are 5 key things that I see through our story that define what a covenantal entrepreneur is. And a covenantal entrepreneur approaches business with a mindset that is shaped by faith and a commitment to the relationships and community. A covenantal entrepreneur is a moral actor. They are conscious of their moral responsibility to their community. They're conscious of their duty, and they're conscious to the fidelity of the relationships that they are invested in. A covenantal entrepreneur is relationally embedded. A covenantal entrepreneur that invests in its community, that invests in its workers, that invests in the flourishing of it. It invests in the time and space between the interactions that they have with either their colleagues or their employees or their clients. The covenantal entrepreneur is proactive in virtue. They deliberately model the virtues of covenant through justice, love, reconciliation, mercy, kindness. All of the fruits of the Spirit is what I'm talking about. They model and they're proactive in them. A covenantal entrepreneur is more than a market maximizer. Now, this is the point that I'm trying to make across here, is that the market has often defined entrepreneurship as something that is someone who is an innovator, who is a risk taker, who is someone who creates value through identifying new markets to produce goods and services that serve a client base. That definition of entrepreneurship has been uprooted from its home, and it's become this own thing that the market defines as entrepreneurs. We are living in a world where the market defines what an entrepreneur's behaviors are, that is, and fundamentally completely out of context to who an entrepreneur is as a person, to who an entrepreneur's identity belongs to where an entrepreneur is living and breathing. These entrepreneurs, they're aware of their community, they're aware of their church, they're aware of their people. And with that, they are more than a market maximizer. They see that their business is a vocation for bringing good through their actions, not just profit. And fifthly, they are agents of human flourishing. We are Christian entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship in its own right is a vocation worthy of bishops, as Nelson said. We foster human flourishing, and through enterprise and through the actions of entrepreneurship, we can extend covenant to where it isn't. When we think about covenant in a market sense, and we think about people who are untouched or untapped by covenantal values today, that is an emerging market for us as Christian entrepreneurs. And we need to go and seize that. We need to see entrepreneurship in the same way that God sees it. And so what is not covenantal entrepreneurship? Something that isn't covenantal entrepreneurship is someone who has the business mindset that is self-serving, that is isolated, and that is purely transactional. So they are someone who prioritizes personal gain over community, fairness, and ethical responsibility. In the world today, we have people that we celebrate for their innovation, that we celebrate for their creativity, for their ability to accumulate masses of wealth. But that is just one example of an entrepreneur. And I would argue that that isn't a covenantal entrepreneur. That is someone who has probably hustled at the expense of covenant, at the expense of community, at the expense of building a kingdom that God is calling us into. And we need to model it differently. We saw in the 17th and 19th centuries that there was such a critical mass of Christian entrepreneurs that it changed the dynamic of markets entirely and led governments to changing policy on it that we all benefit from today. During that period, it is estimated that between 50 and 80% of all entrepreneurs involved with the Industrial Revolution were nonconformist. We had a critical majority that defined market norms and behaviors that led to the opportunities for building a better world. And I believe that we can do that today as well. And so with that, we take a look at today's global landscape of faith-driven entrepreneurs. When we look at faith-driven entrepreneurship from a data perspective, there isn't a lot out there. A lot of the information that is available is often anecdotal, but because entrepreneurship is such a driving force of economic change, there's a lot of people studying it. There's a lot of people who are looking at it, and I'm included in that. I'm an entrepreneurship researcher, and so when I set out to look at this topic, I wanted to know how many Christian entrepreneurs are there in the world. And there isn't just one data source that looks at this, but we can, with data that is out there, we can tell some interesting stories and we can get closer to that picture. And so this is what this table represents. Across the world, we know that there are 2 to 3 billion Christians in the world. Many of those are children, and so as an adult population, there's around 1.8, 1.9 billion adult Christians in the world. When we break that down by region, we can see the differences in where those entrepreneurs are. Similarly, we can look at data such as the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, who track global patterns of entrepreneurship, and they set averages for entrepreneurialism among populations, and their base TEA, by the way, stands for total early stage entrepreneurial activity. So it's sort of people who are starting businesses or people who are running new businesses within the last 3 years, and they set a base rate for these regions, and an average base rate for these regions encompasses all of the population. And now when we look at the adjustment, these adjustments are basically some tweaks to the base rate to try and get us closer to a number that looks more like Christian entrepreneurship. And by this, I'm talking about that I've adjusted up and down the different rates based on things like the social economic factors, denominational tendencies towards entrepreneurship, gender, urbanization levels, religious persecution. All of these factors affect whether or not people are interested or they're pursuing entrepreneurship or not. And so we get to this adjusted TEA rate for Christians. And when we multiply that all out against the total number of Christians, we get this wonderful figure of potentially up to 420 million Christian entrepreneurs in the world today. That's a huge number, but we also need to ask ourselves, to what extent are all of these faith-driven entrepreneurs transformed by the renewing of their mind and are embracing covenantal entrepreneurship and covenantal capitalism? Because a lot of the world that we work in today, entrepreneurship tends to be defined by the market, and the market rules. There's a professor of divinity at Harvard who talks about this quite a lot. His name is Henry Cox, and he's written a book called The Market as God. And it's basically on this topic about how we have lost our way with market dynamics and how everything becomes defined by market norms and by market relationships. And when we foreground these sort of market norms and market relationships, we tend to background these non-market values, such as things that don't serve the market, like trust, like reconciliation, like justice. These tend to not be in the equation of profitability or efficiency for a lot of people, and they tend to be externalized or externalities to the business. Fortunately, we're in a situation now where some of this is changing, but I think fundamentally it's a calling on faith-driven entrepreneurs, particularly with such a critical mass like this, that we need to be having a renewal of the mind to adopt covenantal capitalism again, to ensure that we are bringing these virtues of the kingdom back into our business practices. But faith-driven entrepreneurship is not a monolithic group, and entrepreneurs tend to operate across a range of different industries and economic contexts. And this diagram here on the left is from a faith-driven entrepreneur report that was produced a few years ago that was trying to articulate what Christian entrepreneurship ecosystems look like. And globally, the types of Christian enterprises that are being built or being launched tend to reflect more or less the broader entrepreneurial dynamics that we see around the globe. And in principle, these can be broken down into 3 different classes of business. We have what are called oxen enterprises. We have gazelle enterprises, and we have unicorn enterprises. The oxen enterprises tend to be these slow growth, regional, sort of built on the endowments, such as agriculture, manufacturing, energy, engineering, that are slow growth, and they provide jobs, they provide incomes, and they support communities. And then we have these niche ventures, which are these what we call gazelles, and these are niche market initiatives that capture value through offering particular types of innovation. And then we have these high growth ventures that we're called unicorns, that the market sets that like essentially everyone should be pursuing the unicorn. That tends to be the most famous thing that an entrepreneur can achieve in their life, is to become a unicorn. But I would argue the most famous thing that an entrepreneur can do in their life is to leave a legacy for the Christians that are coming through to build God's kingdom. And on the right, I just broke these statistics down against sort of regional averages so that we can showcase what types of Christian enterprise archetypes might, or arguably, I would say, look like by region. And so, for example, across Africa and Asia and Latin America, a large share of these enterprises are oxen, and then between 15 and 25% of them are gazelles, and then 5% unicorns. And the trends sort of go up and down based on historical global wealth accumulation, such as in Europe and North America. But the trends are there, and it also tells a story about the types of Christian entrepreneurs that our different areas of the world occupy. So when we talk about how do we as Christian entrepreneurs in, say, Europe solve the crises that Europe are facing, we have to look to our own ecosystems for the answers of what to do next. And the same as with Africa. We have our own ecosystems and our own contexts and our own challenges and our own gifts and our own entrepreneurs that we can use to build covenantal entrepreneurial models for all of our contexts that respond to our own challenges. The examples in Europe that I was talking about earlier, they were responding to particular issues such as political instability or poverty, lack of education, poor health, all of these sort of basic needs that were going overlooked. And they through their innovation and through their covenantal practices of entrepreneurship, they responded to that, and they built an economic system that we inherited. And I think that we can do it again if we believe and we renew our covenant in business with God. And so this is where we get to a story about what Christian enterprise looks like today across the global landscape. This diagram here looks complicated, but it's actually quite a simple story when you unpack it. So this line here, I don't know if people have seen this before, but this is a really famous diagram that came out in 2013 that basically mapped over the last 30 years between 88 and 2008 how global income distributions mirrored up with different rates of income growth. And so along the bottom line we have the percentile of income distribution, and on the y-axis we have income growth rate. And this basically tells the story that the 0 to 20 tend to be the poorest countries in the world, and as a share of total global income growth, they've received very little. They've received one of the smallest shares of growth of the last 30 years. And this is what we call the tail. As we move into the green, this is sort of the emerging middle class and emerging the emerging economies and the emerging middle class, such as China, India, including aspects of Africa, like Nigeria's economy are probably lumped in here as well. That these emerging middle class countries and middle income countries have taken the bulk of wealth over the last 30 years, and they will define trends going into the future. In the yellow, we have stagnating middle class developed countries, and so the UK is in here, Europe is in here, a lot of America in here, and this group, this percentile here, represents a middle class of Western stagnated economies that have actually received some of the lowest proportions of the share of global wealth of the last 30 years, which is actually incredibly surprising when you think of the stories that are being told about people like Elon Musk. But actually there are vast levels of inequality across Western economies as a result of this trend of economic distribution. And then here at the tip, we have the global elite. We have the top percentile of the most rich in the world. And it's here that wealth has become the most accumulated. But what this story shows is that whenever we think about the types of faith-driven entrepreneurs that are operating across the globe, we also have to see that they are also operating within certain contexts. So these X's on here indicate that there are faith-driven entrepreneurs who are all operating in these different economic contexts, that they are all wrestling with the social and economic challenges of where they live in their markets, and they are building enterprises that respond to this, that respond to these challenges. And this table on the next page illustrates just some of them. This, for me, was a really fun exercise. I wanted to know, based on those graph, based on what types of economies faith-driven entrepreneurs exist in, what types of businesses are they running? And this was a fascinating exercise for me, because this only took me about 20 minutes to Google, saying what types of unicorn ventures are Christian oriented and what types of gazelle and oxen enterprises are founded by Christian entrepreneurs who adopt covenantal Christian values. And there's bags of them. We have over here unicorns, all of these here. We have Andela, we have MIC Global, which I think are Nigeria, Flutterwave, which are all Nigerian firms. All of them went to unicorn, Bridge International Schools, EcoNet Wireless, Digital Missions, Bandwidth. These are all unicorn billion-dollar plus companies that are all serving principles of God's kingdom, or have attitudes or values within their company that reflect God's kingdom. Similarly with the Gazelle enterprises, we have the African Leadership Group, and we have Tom's and Hobby Lobby. All of them have captured niche markets to serve particular issues. Everyone, I imagine a lot of people have heard of the Tom's buy one model, which is you buy a pair of shoes, you give a pair of shoes, but the profits that go into that company are reinvested. And the founder is a lover of Jesus, and he doesn't shy away from that. And then we have these oxen ventures here, where they are slow regional growth, but scalable ones that often create lots of jobs. 10 Cents Africa are a fascinating company in Kenya that are doing incredible work with paying fair wages for macadamia nuts. And the same story is, I'm sure, within the room that I'm talking to. There are entrepreneurs in there that would fit under all of these categories, and all of them reflecting on the values that they're bringing to building a covenantal economics. And so I'm coming in to land now. I've probably got about 3 more slides to go. And this is probably the best part of this talk for me, because it reflects to me what do we do now when we talk about the origins of covenantal capitalism back in the 17th and 19th centuries that built businesses that responded to their needs, that helped to bring minimum wage and health and insurance to people. What what can we do today based on the data that we know, the stories that we have and we have inherited, and the information that's available. And so I wanted to just pull this together to demonstrate what are the opportunities for different faith-driven entrepreneurs across their different economic contexts. What are the opportunities for faith-driven entrepreneurs to address different areas of the global economy, whether that be at the tail of the elephant, or the torso, or the trunk, or the tip? And so I want to just reflect a little bit on some of these, just to illustrate what are the opportunities that we as Christians can be looking at to invest our time in business, to serve and reignite a covenantal entrepreneurial model for faith-driven entrepreneurship. So if we look at the tail, for example, if we are looking at the bottom 20% of the poorest countries in the world, we have some of the economic context there is that it's the global poor, it's persistent poverty. Some of the economic challenges are the limited market access and poor infrastructure. These challenges manifest into often, for an entrepreneur, low market demand, poor infrastructure, dependency risks, and government barriers. You would all say that they're challenges that entrepreneurs face. When we look over on the right-hand side to endowments, though, we also see the opportunities that are there. For example, in the bottom 20%, we tend to see untapped populations, communities that have strong social roots and strong church networks. And then in order to build those ecosystems, people tend to need catalytic funding, low cost, high impact infrastructure, and inclusive services like microfinance. Within this story, for me, it tells a strategy or a wireframe of opportunities that people could go and take this and say, I'm going to be a faith-driven covenantal entrepreneur, and I know I'm going to focus on the bottom 20% of the elephant curve, and here are the challenges, but here are the opportunities for me to do something different in this market. For example, the opportunities in this piece would be scaling basic services, whether it be telemedicine, renewable energy, healthcare, mobile tech. Faith-driven entrepreneurs should focus on building asset building models of business, so it's setting up cooperative models of doing commerce, shared ownership, so that the global poor can start building their savings base. They can start investing. They can start putting money aside for acquiring property or other assets. Faith-driven entrepreneurs can focus on community-driven initiatives to provide localized solutions like financial inclusion, and also focus on some of the challenges such as creating a labor-rich services and manufacturing. The 1 million jobs that Nelson is going to be changing are probably going to be drawing from some of these ideas, particularly the labor-rich jobs in manufacturing. And if we look at the torso, for example, the torso reflects some of the emerging markets that have gained prominence, such as India and China. They might be doing brilliantly, but they're still privy to some of the same economic structures of that the West have been inherited. And so if we're not careful, they will follow the similar trends of inequality that the West are facing right now. And we will be facing massive billionaires with the poorest of the poor, and it'll be entrenched. But some of the economic challenges of the torso are there's a rising middle class and an aspiration, but there's high price sensitivity. But this group are the backbone of global economic growth, and it was here that we need to be paying close attention to how we reform. Some of the challenges that they face are price sensitivity, fragmented markets, and infrastructure gaps. However, a lot of these emerging markets also have massive youthful populations with increasing demand for education, healthcare, and technology. Some of the faith-driven entrepreneurship opportunities in this segment would look like providing localized affordable products and financial inclusion tools, making sure that affordable housing and education are available, and providing innovative delivery mechanisms, such as making the most of technology to help leapfrog sort of wider brick and mortar barriers. But to build ecosystems like this, we need to provide market-specific accelerators and incubators that can help level the playing field. And I could tell this story for the trunk and the tip as well. But what excites me for this is that we can take the data that we've got of the global context of entrepreneurship. We can tell the story of covenantal entrepreneurs that have gone before us, and we can say, we can see a market opportunity where we can support and solve some of the challenges that each of these different segments of the elephant face. And we can come to them with business solutions that also reflect covenantal values. And if we were to take this a step further and break it down by region, I put this as food for thought. And when we look at sort of the tail, the torso, the tip, and the trunk, we can see different insights and different opportunities where these economies could thrive. Between this slide and the last slide, I would say you've got a number of different value propositions that you could take and go and trial setting up enterprises or moving your business models to reflect some of these opportunities that look like solving today's global challenges of development, but you can also do that in a covenantal way. So if we look at Africa, for example, the key features of Africa's sort of broader and entrepreneurial landscape is that most of them are SME-driven ecosystems. You have strong church community networks and rapid mobile and fintech adoption. The opportunities for faith-driven entrepreneurs here for serving either the tail or the torso could be like, for example, leveraging technology for scalable solutions in agribusiness and other local industries. That solution coupled with covenantal enterprise, you can do significant good for solving some of the challenges that we face as a world today. And on the right-hand side, we have ecosystem development needs that also look like opportunities for entrepreneurs to double down on by providing and building the architecture for these covenantal entrepreneurial ecosystems that we need to strengthen. We need to strengthen the mentorship and capacity building of faith-driven entrepreneurs, and we need to integrate as well the wider infrastructure that we need to serve those that we live with and the neighborhoods that we live in. So finally, bringing it all together in one final, hopefully well-storied slide is what does Covenant offer us as a vision for today's faith-driven entrepreneur? We've looked at the historical foundations that covenantal principles shaped our innovation and our economics today. They provided justice-centered businesses that uplifted communities and solved some of the ills that we're told as Christians that we need to address. We need to serve the orphan, the widow, the sick, and the poor. These historical Christian entrepreneurs, they saw that as a vocation for their life and through their business to serve that. And as Covenant is also a framework for today, we can look at Covenant as we have just done, as a framework for addressing global economic fractures with covenantal practices. I hope the elephant graph highlighted what some of the economic fractures are in our world today, where the challenges of inequality lie, where some of the challenges of market opportunities are, and where the opportunities for Christians to change that are. And then finally, like the promise of covenant, for me as a faith-driven entrepreneur and researcher, also I invite for you to reflect on is the promise of covenant is the opportunity for us to reimagine entrepreneurship as a sacred calling that heals divisions, restores relationships, and advances God's kingdom. I just want to say that again. The promise of covenant helps us to reimagine entrepreneurship as a sacred calling to heal divisions, restore relationships, and advances God's kingdom. And some of those key principles for faith-driven entrepreneurs today in a practical way look like empowering the marginalized, addressing the systemic barriers that we see across the world, but we do that with relational accountability and sustainability. And what I mean by relational accountability is if we do that in a covenantal way, we strengthen the ties, the moral, spiritual ties that we have as Christians to ourselves and to our acts and to our work that then foster sustainability. Addressing systemic barriers with these things is just doing it covenantally. Secondly, fostering inclusive growth. If we can enable flourishing of all stakeholders, especially the rising middle class, we can try and avoid some of the failures of the current economic system that are causing havoc on other areas of the economy around the world. Thirdly, we need to restore trust. Building businesses that are rooted in integrity and mutual care are a priority. I think in Europe, particularly, this is a challenge where People have lost significant trust in institutions. They are deeply skeptical of businesses. And we saw that in the financial crisis of 2008. And we haven't recovered from that as a continent. And fourthly, we also need to transform wealth. We need to align our resources with God's vision for justice and reconciliation. And this more speaks to a broader relationship that we need to redefine as Christians with wealth, but also that can be segmented into the sort of the global elite. How do we reform as Christians those market mechanisms that help us to align our resources with God's vision? So finally, I just want to say thank you very much for listening. And I tried to go faster than perhaps I wished because I'm aware of time. But I wanted to leave you all with 3 questions. I wanted to invite you all to reflect on these 3 questions, take them home with you, discuss them in your chairs if you have time. But they hopefully try to articulate what this story has been about, and invite you to reflect from your own position as a faith-driven entrepreneur, whether that's a multi-time founder or someone who's aspiring to set up a business, or someone who's an investor looking to do good work. Covenantal capitalism works. It offers us a solution that we can rebalance our covenantal relationship through God that leads to an outworking of fostering an economy that serves all of us, and extends God's kingdom to those who don't yet know him. Thank you very much.
Wow. Wow. Stephen, I hope you can hear the round of applause. That was, wow. I mean, I can say a lot of things about it, but one of the things I think I'll use is revolutionary. Because sometimes as business people, faith-driven business people, we engage the market and we despair sometimes because it looks like that God called market is winning and we are losing. But one of the things I think you've done for us, taking us back history lessons to show us that truly we are winning. Because when we read historical books, we know how really vile the marketplace used to be, how employees had no rights and all of that. But with showing us how over the years, faith and covenant-driven businesses have, changed the narrative, changed the culture. Minimum wage, and health insurance and all that is really heartwarming to know that we are not on the losing side. We are making an impact and we are changing things. It may not look dramatic, but surely there's something happening. Thank you so much. And I mean, the elephant curve, is simply mind-blowing because that helps us really know where to focus our energy. So we are striking at the right spot and we are really, getting the most value for what we are doing. Thank you so much again, Stephen. I think Stephen deserves another round of applause. Yeah, and I thank you, the online audience as well, for that online applause. I can see you, Olamide Dauda. Yeah, thank you. I see you, Benga, as well. Wow, thank you so much. This has been simply wonderful. I mean, this is just day 1 of the conference, so we can imagine what day 2 is going to be like. I mean, we still have a full lineup for tomorrow. So if we have questions, I believe we can take some questions. I mean, it's, getting late, but I just crave our indulgence to just take a few questions. So if you have questions online, please, so I can see some questions. So if you have questions online, I can see Faith, right? Faith, your hands are raised up. So I think we'll start with the guys online and then we'll come to the people in the room. So let's start with Faith, please. Faith, let's have your question. You can unmute and ask your question. Faith, can you hear us? If you are speaking, Faith, you are muted. We can't hear you yet. So I saw Faith's hand up. I see Royal Line Foods. So we'll start with Faith and then we'll come to Royal Line Foods. So Faith, can you hear us? Okay, maybe we'll go to Royal Line Foods. You can unmute and ask your question. Yeah, Royal Line Foods. We cannot hear you yet.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, please carry on.
Yes, good evening, everyone. And permit me to say I'm sorry I joined the call late, but then the little bit I have heard, I appreciate and I really enjoyed it. So I'd like to ask that will the recording be made available for us after this session, so someone like me who came late can go over it and understand, have a full grasp of what has been discussed so far before the session tomorrow? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Faith. Yes, the recording made available. The slides would, tonight, the slides also will be made available. And I assure you, are not alone. Even those of us in the room are likely going to go back to listening to these things again, because it's been quite mind-blowing from the first session with Nelson and then with Stephen on the second session. So you are not alone on that. Is there any other one online who wants to ask a question? Faith, do you still want to ask a question? You can unmute and we can take your question now. Okay, yeah, thank you. So you get the slides online. So in the room, if there's anyone with a question, if you just signify, is there a second microphone? Yeah, so please, if you have a question in the room, I have a question, but I'll let others ask and then I'll come back. So Stephen, I have a question for you, but I'll let others ask before we come back to that question. So is there anyone with a question in the room? Okay, maybe I'll get started with my question and then we'll see if we have other questions. So Stephen, thank you so much, because like I said, one of the things your presentation has done for me is, I'm sure in your engagement and in your business, Stephen, over the world, you have an idea of what it's like in Africa. You might have heard some of the stories of Nigeria, but I'm a lawyer, and in the course of my work in Nigeria, there are a lot of things. One of the things you mentioned, which I've seen really play at work, is contractual maximizers. People who, I do some cases, yes, I win the case, but I really don't know if my conscience is really at rest, because I know a person has just seen a crack in the hole somewhere. He's taking advantage of the fact that maybe he's in business with someone who is a little bit more trusting, who wasn't exactly all about putting everything down in black and white. And there's some people who are really experts, at playing the gap once they find the gap. Essentially what you mentioned about a contractual maximizers. So one question I want to ask, because I've also seen people who sometimes I assume act with a covenant mindset, who go into businesses, and because they are good, they perhaps also take that trusting attitude and sometimes let their guard down and get taken advantage of. So I'm really wondering, how do we draw that line between being a covenant mindset person and also being very cautious about contracts and ensuring that the I's are crossed, the T's, the I's are dotted, and the T's are crossed. Because sometimes, I don't know, it almost seems like it's a contradiction, because sometimes you press, you really want things to be documented and all, and then it looks like, have some faith, have some trust. But sometimes you try to have faith and have trust and you get your fingers burned. So as Christian entrepreneurs, where do we draw the line when it comes to ensuring that we actually have things put into contract in cold, black and white? And when do we just in faith and in trust just, carry on transactions? How would you advise, and where do you think we should draw the line there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I think my laptop has crashed to a second. Wow, that's a question, and I think that's a golden question. If I had an answer for that right now, I'm sure we all wouldn't need to be in the room asking. I think one of the things that fascinates me as an entrepreneur was also thinking about what is the purpose of law and what is the purpose of a contract, and what did it used to serve, and what does it serve today? And I think contract is king today, right? Whereas covenant was king, and we evolved to use law and we evolved to use contract out of an original covenantal framework that was designed to foster guarantee where there needed to be trust. Where trust used to be informal agreements, we needed these contracts that could extend to a stranger, where a self-interested person and another self-interested person could come together and agree a certain type of transaction and that they would both benefit. What I think has been lost is a critical mass of trust. And what I mean by that, we see where covenant used to be a dominant form of mediating relationships, and where it exemplified the outworking of things like reconciliation, like justice, like faith and love and mercy. Those values were foregrounded. They were foregrounded as virtues of good business. But we've lost those today. We've lost the visibility of those virtues in what is defining as good business. And so now we are just relying on these contracts without those virtues in visible terms to mediate those relationships. And I think as Christian entrepreneurs, we have a dual responsibility to, one, rebalance the scale to model a form of those virtues where contract can be put back in its place and covenant can mediate those relationships, but also to defend what is kingdom, right? And what is kingdom? God talks about justice. He talks about mercy. He talks about care for the orphan, the widow, the sick, and the poor. And I think when we come to determining what we need to defend in contracts, is like, what is our bottom line? Our bottom line isn't profit. Our bottom line is the kingdom. And I think what I'm trying to say with this point is that when we look for examples of inspiration of how to change the system and how to change the game, we have often lent on contemporary market norms to do so. But we have a powerful legacy that we can model and look back through how the Quakers or how the Methodists or how the Unitarians did business differently. And they often drew on an example like Jesus, right? Like, Jesus didn't say turn the other cheek because he was meek and mild. He said to turn the other cheek because it was determining the relationship between a slave and a master, where if he was to be slapped by the inside of his palm, the slave would turn his cheek to the right, and if the master says to slap him again and he turns the other cheek to invite being slapped, he would slap him with the back of his palm. And if the slave did that and the master had to follow through with punishment, he would be slapping him with the inside of his palm again, which would be a sign of equality, which would completely destroy the standard of the contemporary relationship of master and slave. And I think we have to be innovative and creative in our thinking to know what battles to pick, because there are battles to be won, but there's a war being waged. And we have to identify which those are in the contract can serve that purpose in a creative way with the mechanisms that we have available, but then also model an alternative for the world around us.